I thought my wife was caring for my mother, until I realized they were recording me like I was the enemy. There was only one question left in my head that night. How long had I been the one being played? I was 34. My wife was 32. We had been married for 8 years. From the outside, our life looked steady. Middle-class house on a quiet street. Same departure times every morning. Same lights off at 23:40. No loud fights, no visible damage. The kind of marriage people stopped asking questions about. Then my mother turned 60 and had a small stroke. Nothing dramatic, but enough to scare her. My wife suggested she move in with us. She said it quietly one evening while folding laundry. I agreed. It felt like the decent thing. I told myself I had chosen well. My mother arrived on a Tuesday at 14:15. 2 suitcases and a walker. My wife had already cleared the guest room, moved her own desk out, and bought new sheets. She rearranged the entire upstairs in one weekend. She adjusted her shifts at the clinic so she could be home by 17:30 every day. She cooked separate meals, sorted medication into small plastic boxes labeled by time, and kept the bathroom spotless. At first it looked like care, but small things started appearing. At 8:15, I would come downstairs and find my wife already sitting with my mother at the kitchen table. My coffee mug had been moved to a different cabinet. The newspaper I usually read was folded on my mother's side. My wife never mentioned it. She simply smiled when I entered and poured my mother's tea first. By the 3rd week, my mother's room smelled faintly of lavender and something else I could not name. My wife spent 40 minutes there every evening after dinner. The door stayed closed. When I passed in the hallway, I heard only low movement, never voices. I never asked what they talked about. I told myself it was none of my business. One night at 23:40, I woke up and noticed the bed beside me was empty. I went downstairs. The kitchen light was on. My wife stood at the counter writing something on a small notepad. She tore the page off, folded it twice, and slipped it into the pocket of her robe. When she saw me, she simply turned the kettle on and asked if I wanted water. I said no and went back to bed. She stayed downstairs another 20 minutes. The next morning, my mother's walker had been moved closer to the window. A new cushion appeared on her chair. My wife had reorganized the family photos on the living room shelf. My mother's picture from 20 years ago now sat in front. Ours had been shifted half an inch to the left. The tilt was gentle, almost polite. Yet every day the house felt a fraction smaller. My routines bent around new rules I had never agreed to. My wife's attention had found a new center, and I circled it at a distance, watching. I still believed it was kindness. I just could not explain why the kindness never seemed to include me anymore, and why some nights, when I lay awake at 2:17 listening to the silence between their closed doors, I started to wonder what exactly my wife was writing on those small pieces of paper. The first thing I noticed wasn't loud. It was control. My wife began setting my mother's schedule with surgical precision. Nap at exactly 14:30. No phone calls after 20 o'clock. The bedroom curtains had to stay half-drawn until 16:15. Meals arrived on a tray at 18:45, never later. My mother accepted every rule without resistance. She, who once argued with doctors and refused help from anyone, now followed every instruction as if it had always been this way. That alone felt wrong. I watched from the hallway at 14:28 as my wife gently closed the bedroom door. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have. 10 minutes later, I passed again. The door was still shut. No sound came from inside. Not even the television my mother usually left running. Then came the lock. My wife installed it on a Thursday afternoon while I was at work. A simple deadbolt, brass finish. It worked from both sides. When I got home at 18:10, the new hardware gleamed under the hallway light. My wife stood on a small stepladder, wiping the frame with a cloth. She said nothing about it. I ran my thumb over the cool metal and felt the keyhole on the outside. She called it boundaries. The next evening at 21:20, I heard the bolt slide shut from inside the room. My mother never locked doors in her life. Yet now she did it every night at the same time, as if trained. I stood in the dark corridor listening to the soft metallic sound repeat itself. Then silence. Heavy, deliberate silence. My wife's routines grew tighter around the new system. She carried a small notebook in her cardigan pocket and checked it every few hours. At 19:55, she would enter the room for exactly 12 minutes, close the door, and come out with the tray. The notebook stayed in her hand. She never left it lying around. One night at 2:40 I woke to the faint sound of footsteps. I went downstairs for water. The notebook sat open on the kitchen counter under the dim-range hoodlight. 2 pages of neat handwriting faced up. Before I could step closer, my wife appeared behind me, reached past my shoulder, and closed it without a word. She placed it in her robe pocket and turned off the light. The house felt narrower after that. My mother smiled more than she used to. A calm, distant smile I had never seen on her face before. She moved slower, spoke less, and never complained. Not once. The strong-willed woman who raised me had quietly stepped aside for something smoother. Something managed. I kept telling myself it was care. But every time that brass bolt slid into place at 21:20, the same question returned. Why did a 60-year-old woman who once feared nothing now need to be locked in her room from the outside? And why did my wife check the notebook like someone guarding a secret she refused to share? Things didn't get worse all at once. They layered. My mother began asking me to leave her room after 10 minutes. She would glance at the clock on the nightstand at exactly 19:05 and shift in her chair. I started noticing she repeated my wife's phrases in the same measured tone. Stress is dangerous. Avoid confusion. Trust the judgment given. The words came out flat, almost memorized. They never sounded like her own thoughts. That change settled in slowly. Whenever I came home earlier than expected, the house adjusted itself. At 16:51 afternoon, the living room felt quiet the moment my key turned in the lock. Footsteps moved upstairs. A door clicked shut on the second floor. By the time I reached the kitchen, my wife stood at the sink rinsing a single glass. She turned and offered a quick, even smile that arrived a second too late. I began checking small things without admitting why. My mother's bank statements arrived on the 15th of every month. They showed nothing unusual, only the usual withdrawals handled through my wife. Medical appointments were always scheduled by her. Phone records showed almost no outgoing calls after 20 o'clock and very few incoming. The logs looked curated. Then one night at 23:15, I opened the hallway cabinet for a light bulb and found a spare phone charger tucked behind the spare towels. The cable was still warm. No phone I recognized used that model. I closed the cabinet and said nothing. Later that same night at 1:40, I stood outside my mother's door. Faint audio leaked through the wood. My wife's voice, calm and steady. Then my mother's voice answering in the same rehearsed rhythm. The exchange sounded structured, like lines being practiced, back and forth. Pause. Repeat. The recording played softly for another 6 minutes before it stopped. I remained still in the dark hallway, fingers resting against the brass lock. The house had grown quieter than before. My mother's smile stayed polite and distant. My wife moved through the days with tighter control, her notebook always closed. Everything appeared helpful on the surface. But the spare charger in the cabinet and the scripted voices behind the locked door suggested something else. I wasn't watching a family caring for an aging parent anymore. I was watching 2 people follow a plan I had never been told about. And I still had no idea how deep that plan already ran. The discovery came by accident. I reached for the remote on the guest chair at 19:40 and felt something hard under the cushion. A phone. No case, no lock screen. It lit up the moment I picked it up. The home screen showed rows of audio files. Hundreds of them, neatly dated and labeled. I sat down slowly and pressed play on the most recent one. My wife's voice filled the small speaker first. Calm, measured, instructional. She spoke in clear segments, pausing at precise intervals. Then my mother answered. The exchange moved like a practiced routine. They adjusted wording, tested tones, corrected each other's timing. It did not sound like conversation. It sounded like rehearsal. I kept listening. File names scrolled past as I swiped. Inheritance alignment, Session 7. Identity verification practice, scenario for correction. The dates reached back 7 months, long before my mother had moved in. One file from 3 weeks earlier lasted 14 minutes. I played it at low volume. My wife's voice came through clearly. Instructions about paperwork, consistency, and how certain questions should be handled. My mother responded with quiet agreement, repeating key lines until the phrasing felt natural. Their voices never rose. They simply worked. I set the phone down exactly as I had found it and returned the cushion to its original position. The house was silent at 25. My mother's door remained locked from the inside. My wife moved downstairs in the kitchen, arranging tomorrow's medication trays with the same steady hands I had watched for months. Nothing in her posture suggested anything unusual, but everything had shifted. My mother was not being managed. She was participating. The soft compliance, the rehearsed smiles, the locked door at 21:20 each night, all of it served a shared purpose. They had been building something together while I moved through the days believing I was protecting them both. I stood in the hallway for a long minute, listening to the faint sounds of my wife washing a glass. The marriage I thought I had no longer felt like a marriage. It felt like the visible part of a longer, quieter arrangement. And I still didn't know how much of the last 8 years had been scripted the same way. I stopped sleeping properly after that. Nights stretched thin. I lay awake until 3:12, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening for any movement in the hallway. Every creak of the floorboards now carried weight. My wife still moved through the house with the same quiet efficiency. She prepared dinner at 18:30, set the table for 3, and passed the salt without hesitation. Her smile remained steady and warm. But the words underneath felt measured, each sentence carrying something I could no longer ignore. My mother sat with me in the living room at 20:10 most evenings. She asked simple questions about my workday, whether I had signed any documents, whether the bank had called. The questions arrived lightly, almost carelessly. After the recordings, nothing landed lightly anymore. I answered briefly and watched her eyes flick once toward the staircase. I started checking documents in the small hours. At 1:45, I sat on the floor of the study with the folder of legal papers, insurance updates, recent amendments to the house deed, a new power of attorney form. Some signatures looked almost right. The loops of the letters matched, yet the pressure of the pen felt different. Slight hesitations in the ink. Enough to feel wrong once you knew where to look. I waited until the following evening. My wife stood at the kitchen counter at 21:25, wiping down the surfaces with slow, deliberate strokes. I placed the phone I had found on the table between us. She glanced at it once, then continued cleaning. Her movements never faltered. She simply acknowledged that she knew I had listened. No raised voice, no denial, just calm acceptance that the discovery had happened. My mother appeared in the doorway at 21:32. She did not rush to explain or defend. She stood with her hands folded and spoke in the same softened tone she had used for months. She told me I was only seeing half the system. Then she turned and walked back toward her room. The brass lock clicked into place at 21:38. The house settled into its usual silence. But that single phrase remained lodged in my mind. Half the system. It suggested layers I had not yet touched. Coordinated steps taken long before my mother moved in. Patterns I had mistaken for kindness. I stood alone in the kitchen long after the lights were turned off, listening to the quiet. They had both known I would find the recordings eventually, and they had already prepared what to say when I did. The question that kept me awake was no longer whether they were hiding something. It was how much of my life had been shaped by the half I still could not see. The confrontation didn't explode. It tightened. I stood in the living room at 21:47 and asked them straight. The words came out low and even. My wife answered without pause, her hand still folded on the arm of the chair. She spoke of protection from chaos I had never seen. My mother sat beside her, back straight, and added something about preserving the family structure. Their voices stayed calm, almost instructional. Then my wife delivered the line that changed the shape of everything. She told me I had never been the decision maker. I had only been the variable. The room felt smaller after that sentence. All the pieces slid into place with clinical clarity. The perfectly timed naps. The locked door at 21:20. The rehearsed phrases my mother repeated like scripture. The notebooks. The spare charger. The audio files labeled with clinical detachment. None of it had been care. It had been coordination of perception. They had been shaping what I noticed, what I signed, what I accepted as normal, and what I later remembered agreeing to. I remembered every evening I had come home to find them already seated, smiles ready, conversation flowing exactly where they wanted it. Every small adjustment to documents I had barely read. Every quiet suggestion that felt like my own idea at the time. They had been watching me watch them. At 22:05 my wife stood and carried the empty teacups to the kitchen. My mother followed a moment later, her steps measured and unhurried. Neither rushed. Neither raised their voice. The brass lock on the upstairs door clicked shut at the usual time, as if the conversation had been just another scheduled session. I remained downstairs long after the lights dimmed. Every memory from the past year now carried a second frame. The noble suggestion to move my mother in, the gentle reorganization of the house, the quiet devotion, all of it had been staging. And I had moved through it believing I was the observer, but I had been the subject. The tightening continued in the silence. They had admitted enough to confirm the mechanism, yet left the full scope untouched. I still didn't know how long the coordination had been running, or how many parts of my life had already been decided without me ever realizing the meeting had taken place. The aftermath didn't involve shouting or dramatic collapse. It involved distance. Legal separation began without ceremony. Papers arrived in plain envelopes at 9:20 on a Tuesday. I signed where indicated, barely reading anymore. The documents contained clauses and references I still cannot fully trace, dates that predated my mother's arrival, notations that suggested preparation long before any visible tension. My wife handled her side with the same quiet efficiency she once used on medication trays. She moved out first on a Thursday at 14:55. 2 suitcases and a single box. She closed the front door without looking back. The sound of her car pulling away faded down the street and left a clean silence behind. My mother followed 3 days later. She left at 10:40 on a Sunday morning. The walker was gone. The lavender scent lingered another week. She took nothing that belonged to the house except the small notebook my wife had carried for months. No farewell. No explanation. Just the soft click of the front door and the house settling into sudden vacancy. The brass lock on the upstairs room remained in place, untouched. I walked through the rooms at 23:40 each night. Everything looked exactly as it had before my mother moved in. The same furniture. The same framed photos, now back in their original order. Yet the space felt engineered. Too normal. Too empty. The kitchen counter held no medication trays. The hallway cabinet contained only towels. No spare charger. No hidden phone. The system had simply shut down. I found small traces in the weeks that followed. A bank statement with transfers I never authorized but had apparently signed. An insurance policy updated with beneficiaries I didn't remember approving. Each document carried my signature in ink that looked almost like mine. The house stayed quiet, but the silence carried weight. They had left without resistance, as if the final phase had completed exactly on schedule. No loose ends. No lingering confrontation. Just absence. I still sit in the living room some nights and stare at the empty chair where my mother used to sit at 2010. The question that refuses to leave is simple. If the system completed its function and moved on, what exactly had its function been? And how much of me had been quietly removed along with them? People think betrayal is loud, but the most terrifying kind isn't. It's organized. It's patient. It looks like care. It sounds like trust. And it builds itself so gradually that by the time you notice the pattern, you're already inside it. I used to think I knew my family. Now I understand something else entirely. Sometimes the people closest to you aren't hiding the truth from you. They're building a version of reality where you'll never think to question it. And the scariest part? For a long time, I didn't.